and you are going to turn these in right after, basically, okay, after you've watched each. So starting with 4.2. Topic 4.2 I've included on the slide here, okay? Double check my recording, looks good. Topic 4.2, the learning objective. If you were, if you pull up the topic or if you just look at the slide right here, there's two learning objectives for this. A governance-focused one and an economics-focused one. The first one is describe the role of states in the expansion of maritime exploration from 1450 to 1750. What role are the states, the kingdoms, the empires of, in this case, mostly Europe, but we're going to talk about one or two other places as well. What role are they playing? Is their involvement playing in helping this expansion and exploration that we're looking at and talking about? And it said, the key concept or the historical development for that is new state-sponsored transoceanic maritime exploration occurred in this period that's funded by these states. What is this level of involvement from the state and how are they helping things? The other thing we're going to look at is the economic causes and effects of maritime exploration by various European states. So we want to focus on Portuguese development of maritime technology, navigation skills. We'll go over all this stuff here. I just want to have this all posted here so that you see as I'm talking about stuff, if you're like, oh my gosh, what is he talking about still? It's all stuff that we need to talk about, right? This is straight out of the, topics, the list of topics for the AP World History course, right? So I'm not just making anything up or putting anything extra in here. It's all the bare minimum of what we need to cover, all right? So one of the first things that we could use as an example for the ways that states played a role in the expansion of maritime trade is the example of Zheng He, all right, who you have read about a little bit before and who was in one of the crash course videos that you watched. Zheng He was not European, though, right? He was a admiral from the Ming Dynasty, right, who was a Muslim and a eunuch. One of the things we'll talk about is that sort of during this time, Islam is still expanding in the world. We mentioned that in the 4.1 lecture. This is a good example that you've got this guy in China, right, at the peak of their power that is Muslim through the influence of the Mongols and their empire and so on in that area. Zheng He was the admiral of a fleet of ships, 300 ships or larger, that had maybe as many as they say, 27, 28,000 sailors and soldiers and other professionals across this fleet, right? A small floating city, or for this period of time, a large floating city, not by Chinese standards, but definitely by European standards, where some of the biggest cities in Europe around the 1400s have got 40,000 people of them in places like London or Paris, right? This treasure fleet contained these gigantic ships, which I thought I had pictures of, but I don't, all right? I will need to, maybe we'll try and put some up there in the next session, but very big ships that make Columbus's ship look like a very tiny little thing, okay? The difference here is that Zheng He was on a mission of tribute, trade, and diplomacy. Although there's a few occasions where Zheng He and his fleet would like hunt pirates or otherwise became entangled in like kind of local political affairs of people in the Indian Ocean, they were mostly on a diplomatic mission to extend China's sort of diplomatic range and bring tributes to the emperor as a sign of friendship and trade and so on, right? They are not out there trying to expand the empire, trying to establish colonies, trying to even dominate the trade, like we will see will be sort of the early and main goal of Europeans as they enter into that area. One of the things about bringing up the Ming Dynasty and Zheng He is for that point of comparison, so that we can kind of look at one superpower country that got there and what they did in the Indian Ocean, which was try to make friends with people, and then what another group, when the Spanish, the Portuguese, and so on arrive, and what they do, which from early days is try to dominate, right? Try to dominate and control. Not that China wasn't trying to dominate and control people. They were just doing that in a land-based empire, not an overseas kind of style, all right? These voyages end, though, right? We read about and talked about this. These maritime voyages ended shortly after the Yongle Emperor, which means perpetual happiness, the perpetual happiness emperor, died for a couple reasons. One is that it's kind of a lack of return on investment. These trips weren't profitable. It was very big, very expensive navy, and it wasn't really making much money going out and getting these tributes, right? Giraffes, things like that were cool to bring back to China. They weren't incredibly valuable, not enough to make up for the cost of these trips. We talked about sort of this conflict between the eunuchs and the like kind of Confucian scholar gentry of China, and how, you know, the scholars kind of saw this as a pet project of the eunuchs, and they kind of didn't like each other and wanted to get rid of it for that reason. And then also just later Ming emperors weren't interested, right? They sort of perceived a greater threat from northern nomads than they perceived any kind of benefit from these diplomatic and trade expeditions, right? So technically Zheng He is, you know, he's in the early 1400s. He's not quite in 1450, but he's a good example of contextualization, right? Of other things, other maritime voyages that are going on around this time period in the Indian Ocean that would relate to sort of what we're looking at here, right? But remember, he's technically sort of in the last part of, you know, unit whatever, I guess, unit 2. Zebras that they bring back. And this is sort of the routes of Zheng He's voyages. His final voyages take him as far as, you know, the east coast of Africa, the Swahili coast. There are legendary stories that maybe they go further places, but there's not a ton of evidence for that. But you can find some people that say they might have gone to America, they might have gone to other places. I wouldn't get behind any of that, but maybe if you ever dig deeper, you might encounter some of that stuff. All right, state motivations for exploration and expansion. What are the things that are motivating these states to be involved in exploration and expansion in the first place, right? Why are they willing to foot the bill for some of this stuff? One example, one reason is interstate rivalries, right? Rivalries between these kingdoms or empires in Europe, for example. Europe in 1450 to 1750 was no less divided or war-torn than medieval Europe had been. The violence was just backed by more stable states. And you see some examples of those rivalries in the Protestant Reformation lecture, if you watch that. Some of these rivalries could include the one between France and Britain, which goes back to the 100 Years' War of the kind of 1300s, early 1400s. And even kind of a little bit before that, right? That's a rivalry that continues even after this into the 17 and 1800s, kind of up until World War I, really. Portugal and Spain was a less maybe violent rivalry, but one that was also, you know, up there. They were in constant competition and kind of push each other really to these greater ends, mostly to try and impress the Pope a little bit, right? For some kind of Catholic prestige, they had this state rivalry between them. We could talk about rivalries between Protestant and Catholic groups in Europe, usually in the form of like countries, right? England versus Spain or whatever, but from a Protestant versus Catholic perspective. These guys are being motivated to seek new converts abroad, to settle the newly discovered lands in the name of Christianity. And also, like we said, sort of earn favor with the Pope or whoever based on those explorations. And another rivalry we might talk about would be the Ottomans versus Europe. That one of the reasons for expansion I'll talk about in the first lecture when you watch that is that the Ottoman Empire controlled and dominated the trade routes from kind of, you know, East Asia and the Indian Ocean to Europe. And prices were marked up. It was expensive to do business. And so there was this rivalry and outright warfare between the Ottomans and European states. We've looked at in documentaries and talked about. One motivation was to get around their rivals, right? So interstate rivalry is one motivation for exploration and expansion on the parts of these states that are funding it. Religion, I mentioned in there a little bit, is a part of this. These Christian states see it as their duty, or saw it as their duty, to convert the unconverted, right? People that had not been taught about Christianity, The belief is they're sort of going to hell, they're doomed, their souls are in danger, and it was the responsibility of these Catholics and even Protestants to go and convert them and save them. All right. The Reformation is also kind of another reason for some of this, is that it was an opportunity to escape persecution for some of these groups within Europe. It's not really a state motivation, but it's one of the reasons a lot of Protestants might participate in some of this exploration, was to escape some of the persecution they dealt with in certain parts of Europe, and to also to find new converts. Although most of the people going out looking for new converts are the Catholic countries. And then the wealth of empire. The wealth of empire was always one of the primary reasons, if not the primary reason, for states to get behind funding exploration. Controlling the trade of spices, silk, etc., wasn't just about sort of looking fly in your silk clothes or your food smelling and tasting really good with these spices, but it was about national power and wealth. Greater wealth came to maritime empires in a couple different ways. One was an increased tax base from the formation of settler colonies, as well as by conquering big, rich empires like the Aztec or the Inca in the Americas, or places like the Congo, the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa. Control of trade routes and monopolies on resources were another path to wealth. Besides sort of the colonies and settlers that you could tax, these kingdoms and empires were trying to establish forts and control ports in a way that allowed them to control trade routes and try to monopolize certain resources like spices and things like that. This is, again, kind of talked about a little bit in the 4.1 lecture, but the goal was to sort of tax the merchants carrying out that trade and profit off of that, so that even if you couldn't monopolize, all the trade in spices, because often Europeans didn't have enough boats to actually handle all the trade in the Indian Ocean, for example, they found ways that we will look at to leverage their technology into a way of kind of controlling some of those resources through these trading post empires we will look at, all right, that taxed the trade of Indian or Southeast Asian or Chinese fleets or Arab fleets moving around those areas between those ports and stuff. But controlling trade routes, monopolizing resources was one way these empires were growing rich. Colonization and resources. Another way that kind of relates to these settler colonies was that besides taxing settlers or conquered subjects like the Aztec or the Inca, colonization had other benefits to the mother country. One was being able to secure and grow resources that weren't found in Europe. All those spices, for example, you just due to climate, right? You couldn't grow whatever, cinnamon or something very well in Europe, maybe in a greenhouse or something, right? But at this time, all that stuff grew kind of in the tropic areas around the equator. And by establishing these colonies, these European countries could start to produce these spices and resources for themselves, right? Making use of plantations and slave labor on those plantations, or finding fresh mines of gold and silver in the relatively sort of like unused continents of North and South America. And silver and gold, related to that, are the most prized resource at that time, as they were the foundation of this economic philosophy known as mercantilism. And that is one of the big goals or motivations of this exploration, is to get a hold of that gold. So we can talk about that a little bit here as well. The effects of state-sponsored exploration were several and many. And so we'll talk about some of the important ones here. One of the important effects of state involvement in exploration and expansion was religious diffusion, the spread of certain religions and the protection of others. Protestant North America, for example, was settled from the east in large numbers by, very loud car coming by mostly the Protestant British and Dutch, and then smaller numbers by the Catholic French. But North America ends up being mostly Protestant because it's the British and the Dutch that are establishing a lot of these settler colonies there. And when groups like Native Americans convert, which they did sometimes, they're converting to Protestant denominations a lot of times in North America instead of Catholic denominations in other parts like South America. South America was mostly Catholic. It's mostly colonized by Catholic Spain and Portugal, although there's some Dutch and British colonies down there as well. And there's also Spanish colonies in North America in what's today, California or New Mexico or Florida. But that is one thing. Sort of the diffusion of these religions is one effect of states being involved in sponsoring these expeditions. They're helping to spread these religions. Probably one of the most important effects is that the states provided the funding for the risky missions of exploration to even happen, right? One of the fact that these expeditions are even going on is an effect of state involvement, right? Columbus couldn't afford that trip on his own. Vasco da Gama couldn't afford the trip on their own. Like, these people oftentimes didn't own the boats they were sailing, right? A boat's very expensive today, like back then. Usually a bunch of people, we'll talk about this later, owned the boat together, or it might have been chartered to you, given to you by the crown, given to you by the royal government, right? And that's kind of how Columbus and some of these, really important figures we'll look at are able to fund these trips in the first place, right? They're not privately financed like some later companies will be. These are all funded by the state. So that's one of the important effects, that they even happen, right? Also, the growth of mercantilism, which I'll try to summarize for you briefly here. Mercantilism grows. This economic philosophy of mercantilism grows by state involvement in exploration, settlement, and colonization. So 17th century states, and 15th, 16th, 17th, and even kind of into the 18th century a little bit. Yeah, even into the 18th century. States measured their wealth and power in the accumulation of gold and silver that they had. This is like one of the cornerstone ideas of this philosophy known as mercantilism. You can think of mercantilism in the same category as capitalism or communism or socialism, any of these kind of economic philosophies, okay? The mercantilist perspective is that a state's wealth or power could be measured by the amount of gold and silver that they had on hand. The reason for this is that those resources were seen as finite, right? As believed, and I guess it's true, that there's only so much gold and silver on the planet, and that the more of that Spain controlled, the less gold and silver there was for everyone else, right? So by getting more gold and silver, you made your country richer and more capable. And by the fact that it was a finite resource, you made all the other countries less rich and powerful and capable, right? So that was one motivation. And in a way that's true, right? We know now, though, that there's a lot more gold and silver to be had depending on where you look, right? And it might not be the case that it's necessarily a finite resource. Mercantilist states set policies that were designed to maximize exports, all right? They wanted to export goods to other countries as much as they could because it was believed that that was going to increase the inflow of gold, right? When you export things, when a country exports things, those are things your country is selling to other countries or to buyers. That means when one country exports a commodity like sugar, let's say, is a big commodity from this period, another country is buying it, either through trade and other valuables. I'm going to give you, silk for your sugar. Or if you don't want the silk for your sugar, I have to give you cash, right? I have to give you gold and silver. This leads to, me getting sugar and you getting gold and silver. As a mercantilist, you would say you came out ahead, that there's plenty more sugar to be grown. There's only so much gold and silver to be found, right? So you're winning. I got sugar that I'm going to eat and it's going to be gone. You've got gold and silver that you can use to build armies and do who knows what, right? The other thing they try to do is minimize imports. They wanted to be as self-sufficient as possible. That's why they're establishing all these colonies, right? They want to reduce the outflow of gold. You don't want to import anything from a foreign country. If you can help it, you want to produce all that stuff on your own. if you're thinking about this already, you can kind of see that this doesn't lend itself to a lot of trade happening, right? If everybody's trying to export but not import anything, well, then there's probably not a lot of trade going on between countries, right? So this is why eventually there's a shift to capitalism. But in a nutshell, that is the idea of mercantilism. There are still people that basically believe this, right? Or things like it. Our own president, very concerned about a negative trade balance with China, for example, right? That's kind of like a mercantilist perspective, that because we're buying more from China than we're selling, we're somehow losing, right? But that's maybe not necessarily how different economic theories like capitalism maybe look at it, right? We'll talk about that more later. But mercantilism, gold and silver are of primary importance, and the way you do that is by maximizing your exports, minimizing your imports. One of the ways that you're doing that is by establishing colonies that are producing a lot of these goods for you, so you're self-sufficient as possible, as self-sufficient as possible. All right. So kind of an infographic I found that relates to this. You know, the goal for the mother country is to be well stocked with gold and silver. That's the measure of your power. The idea for your relationships with other countries is that you wanted a favorable trade balance, right? You wanted the trade to be in your favor. You wanted to be exporting more than you were importing. When you're exporting, you're selling. When you're importing, you're buying. If you're buying stuff, that means gold and silver is leaving your country. That's the opposite of what you want. And so colonies were important in this because they could produce and harvest and mine a lot of that gold and silver and fur, lumber, and other stuff that you either used for yourself so you didn't have to import anything from other countries, or that you exported and sold to other places for gold and silver, all right? Mm-hmm. One of the interesting developments we'll see here is that when Europe goes and tries to do trade in China, China doesn't want anything they have, right? They say, we make everything and it's better than the stuff you make. We only want gold and silver. And Europeans end up losing a lot of gold and silver into this gold and silver drain that was China. We'll talk about that a little later. Okay, so to get into the examples of kind of each country's involvement, okay? We'll talk about some of the important stuff from each place. Your book overlaps with a little bit of this, so I'll try and go quick, but I want to make sure we touch on a couple important developments from each of the big exploring countries, all right? Portugal is the first, right? They're the first ones to go out there and begin doing any of this. So I call them the first, all right? The guy that's really responsible for beginning a lot of this in Portugal is one of the princes of the king at the time, this guy that becomes known as Henry the Navigator, who himself was not a navigator, but who funded and developed, so much of this technology or financed it, that he got this cool name, Henry the Navigator. He is responsible for sponsoring the early expeditions that Portugal begins making down the west coast of Africa, all right? Trying to find the source of gold and slaves and ivory and things like that Europeans had been trading with sub-Saharan Africa, for a while for. Only in this case, they want to cut out those middlemen across the trans-Saharan trade routes, all right? So Henry the Navigator's sponsoring a lot of that. Part of what he's also doing is establishing these schools of navigation and development of different navigational tools and better ships, like the Caravel, one of the ships we talk about in the lecture I posted before this. One of the early explorers, to really make some big, discovery, I guess, is Bartholomew Diaz, okay? Sort of up until this point, the Portuguese had reached islands like the Canary Islands that are a little bit out into the Atlantic Ocean, but still kind of close to Africa. They'd begun already trading in West African slaves, something like 80,000 of them by the end of the century. Dog's getting in trouble, but something really big happens in 1488, where Bartholomew Diaz, this guy, reaches the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern tip of Africa, and can kind of see the Indian Ocean on the other side. His men, they'd been on this boat for a long time. They threatened to mutiny and kind of kill him and turn the boat around. So he goes back home, right? He doesn't let his crew kill him. He listens to them and he goes back home. The guy that goes after him is this guy, Vasco da Gama, and he is, really early on kind of even more important than Columbus because he actually gets to where Europeans wanted to get to. He is the first European to travel by boat to India on this new trade route, okay? And he gets to Calicut, India. Before he gets there, you will see in some of the videos you're watching and some of the stuff you're reading, and I think you already have read some of it, that he is seizing ports, right? He is attacking kind of as soon as he gets to the east coast of Africa, he's attacking cities like Mombasa and Kilwa along the Swahili coast and trying to dominate the trade there using Portuguese guns and boats. It is Vasco da Gama that first enforces the Cartaz system. Does anybody remember what the Cartaz system was? Or, what it was, how that worked? Anybody fill us in on that? Do you remember what the Cartaz system was? Nothing. All right. Well, that was the sale of licenses. Basically, the Portuguese, through Vasco da Gama, would sell licenses to merchants in the Indian Ocean. These people that were already there, had already been trading. Vasco da Gama, his crew, and other Portuguese ships later would attack these ships, force them to purchase this Cartaz license, which would let them go to the ports the Portuguese controlled to trade and do business there, and would also let them not get attacked by the Portuguese in the future. If you could show them this license that you were sailing under the Cartaz, then you would be good. If you didn't have the Cartaz, then they would pirate your ship and goods and take that stuff for themselves, right? So the Portuguese are pirates in the Indian Ocean when they first get there and throughout a lot of their time there. It's very important that you remember their behaviors and actions of seizing these ports. We're going to read a couple documents that relate to that, and making war kind of upon entry into the Indian Ocean. Remember that the Ming Dynasty and Zheng He did no such thing. And the Cartaz system, right? Forcing people to pay to participate in this trade that they'd been participating in for centuries before the arrival of Europeans. Another guy, Afonso de Albuquerque, I don't know that you'll ever need to know his name, but you maybe recognize Albuquerque, is a Portuguese sailor who, his big thing is he becomes sort of governor of the kind of Indian Ocean colonies of Portugal. And as a part of that, he captures the port of Malacca, which is one of the places we talked about in Unit 2 as one of these super rich trade ports that's kind of close to where Singapore is today, and controls this choke point, right? The Strait of Malacca, which is one of the places you have to go through if you want to get from China to the Indian Ocean, right? So they capture that port, and this lets the Portuguese really become very profitable in the Indian Ocean by controlling this narrow pass where they could hit a lot of ships with this Cartaz system and piracy and things like that as they were trading between China and India. It is the Portuguese that first arrive in some of these East Asian countries by boat, right? They visit China, they visit Japan, and there's little initial impact on trade, right? Like I said, in China, they didn't really want anything from the Portuguese, but those traders were followed by Catholic missionaries. In this case, it was initially mostly Franciscans and Dominicans, but later Jesuits followed into China and Japan, and they did make some converts. In China, they used the new technologies and scientific discoveries of Europe to kind of get their foot in the door by offering some of this to the Chinese emperor and trying to kind of impress them with it. And some of those things the Chinese emperor thought was cool, so they let the Jesuits hang out. And they did manage to convert some people, although never a significant amount, all right? And in Japan, it kind of goes bad for the Portuguese, and all the Portuguese end up getting kicked out because of their conversion activities, and a lot of the Christians that they converted end up being killed. We'll look at that a little later on in this unit. But if you remember talking about the Sakoku period for the Tokugawa in one of the earlier lectures we looked at, that's what we're going to kind of talk about here. later, though. The last thing to remember about Portugal is that they are the big example of a trading post empire. And I put that in quotes because that is how historians talk about it. That's how you'll probably see the College Board talk about it on the AP test, as a trading post empire. What that means is that Portugal was too small to really maintain control of all of the Indian Ocean trade. They didn't have enough boats. They didn't have enough people. They weren't wealthy at that time. Instead, Portugal established this trading post empire built around the control of ports and the construction of fortified locations, forts, at important trade routes and choke points, like the Strait of Malacca, where they were able to more effectively implement this Cartaz system, like through guys like da Gama. But, instead of having sort of these big, expansive colonial empires like Spain or Britain or France or something, the Portuguese had these coastal trading posts, right, all over sort of the Indian Ocean and Africa. That was the foundation of their empire, right? Not these big colonial things. The last thing about Portugal is their vulnerability to rivals, European rivals and other rivals in the Indian Ocean. By the 17th century, other European nations had joined Portugal in the Indian Ocean and began to come into conflict with Portugal for control over the trade routes and resources there. For example, the Dutch, like people from the Netherlands, Holland, the Dutch captured Malacca from the Portuguese and built forts in Java around 1620, which let them actually monopolize and control what are called the Spice Islands, what's today Indonesia, the source of a lot of the spices Europe enjoyed and were trying to get to in the first place. So it's the Dutch that actually fulfill this kind of original goal of European explorers, to find the source of these resources and control them. With the valuable prize of the Spice Islands firmly in control of the Dutch, the British focused their attention on South Asia, India, and slowly pushed the Portuguese out of their forts in India and began to dominate the trade there themselves, leaving just a few spots where the Portuguese were still involved in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese, like I said, they're also vulnerable to local powers, such as in the example of Japan that I gave, where the Tokugawa shogun kicks them all out, kills the ones that don't leave, and kills a lot of the Catholic converts in Japan as well because of some of the offenses, of the Portuguese and Catholic missionaries there in the country. All right, Spain, who's not the first, but who is the biggest of these overseas empires, all right? Their voyages began 1492, as we all know, when Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand united the major kingdoms of Castile and Aragon into Spain, into one nation of Spain. After the Portuguese refused to help Columbus, who he goes to first to try and get help, Isabella and Ferdinand agreed to fund Columbus to explore what he said he could find. He thought he could find a western passage to Asia, that he could sail west from Spain and run into India or China, he thought, which you could, right? You can, and people have, but he didn't know that the American continents were in the way. He had, actually sort of greatly overestimated the size of Asia. He thought it was closer, bigger and closer to Europe than it was, and he severely underestimated the size of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, right? Kind of the size of the Earth in general. So that if America wasn't in the way, let's say he didn't run into America, a lot of people are, just looking at what they had on their boats with them. They would have starved to death in the middle of the ocean, right? They were running low on supplies by the time they finally reached the Americas. And that's barely halfway to China or something, right? So there was no chance of him making it. They were lucky to run into the Americas. It would have been hard to miss them, though, because they kind of cover all that space. The American continents were this major obstacle to westward travel from Europe, all right? This discovery would turn out to be a great treasure for Spain, even if it wasn't as initially profitable as some of the voyages of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. We'll talk about that in later topics here. It is Ferdinand Magellan, another Spaniard, or another person in the employment of Spain, that commanded the voyage that first circumnavigates the globe, that first leaves Spain, sails west, and keeps sailing west until they get back to Spain. Okay. And it's actually a great adventure. If you click on that link later when you have time, you can see sort of the whole story, which I would normally like to tell to you, but to keep this a little short, I'm going to have to skip some parts of it. But it is Ferdinand Magellan being funded by the Spanish who completes this first circumnavigation of the globe. But I think Magellan himself was Portuguese. But it's Spain that's paying for this. As part of that circumnavigation, as part of this several-year-long journey, Ferdinand Magellan annexed the Philippines in 1521, which becomes a very important part of the Spanish Empire. And Spain kind of returns there with an army in 1565 and goes to war with the Filipinos to conquer the islands there. Right? It's very bloody, very ruthless. They eventually conquer the islands and convert a lot of the Filipinos to Catholicism. A lot of Filipinos today are Roman Catholics. A lot of them speak Spanish. And they don't establish the city of Manila, but they build forts there. It was already there. And they turn it into this this Spanish trading commercial center that, they begin to control in 1571. And a lot of historians argue that it's with the control of Manila that we can finally talk about a truly global history, because Spanish galleons, Spanish trade ships would leave the west coast of the Americas and sail to Manila and directly trade from America to Asia, right? So for the first time, you've got the Americas involved in trade with Europe and Africa and stuff through other things we'll talk about, like the slave trade and things like that. And you've got the Americas involved in trade with Asia on the other side of the oceans directly, right? Not through any middlemen. So everybody's kind of potentially directly involved with everybody after the establishment of Manila. But again, watch that. There's some neat things about Magellan. He dies on that trip. So it's arguable that Ferdinand Magellan is not the guy that first completes the navigation, but that maybe one of his slaves, actually, one of his cabin hands that was from the Spice Islands originally, that when they passed through the Philippines and the Spice Islands, that slave might have been the first person to actually circumnavigate the globe, which would be an interesting little piece of history there. The other big things about Spanish exploration and conquest is silver from the Americas. The Spanish discover gigantic, literal mountains of silver in the Americas. One such mine was the Potosi mine in Bolivia in South America, near where the Inca Empire was. But something like 60% of all the silver mined in the world during that century was from this mine, right? The majority of all the silver from all of history before 1545, I think 1565 or 1545 is when that city was built. I got to double check on that. But all the silver throughout world history, this still made up for 60% of all the silver in circulation in the world, right? So this literal mountain of silver floods the world with silver. This made Spain and places like China fabulously rich, but also lead to other problems, such as severe inflation in Spain. By bringing all this gold and silver back home, it destabilizes the economy and country, and in China leads to a complete overhaul of the tax and labor systems in China. Remember that they start paying their taxes in silver instead of having the peasants pay in labor. That's because they get all this silver from the Americas suddenly. And it becomes possible for people to do that, right? There's so much silver in circulation now. Again, this silver is mostly used to buy goods in Asia, which lets silver become China's primary currency, basically, and leads to China sort of commercializing their economy. Like you also read about before, Chinese peasants spending their off time making things that could be sold to Europeans or other people. And then the last thing we can mention is very important for Spain is the conquest of the Aztec and Incan empires that were big achievements for the Spanish. We'll examine that more in our readings and other activities and lectures, as well as the extra credit video you might watch in this unit. But these conquests serve to provide gold and more interest in exploration, the gold being sort of the loot and spoils of conquest For example, the Inca emperor Atahualpa is captured by the Spanish and offers to pay a ransom, where he says he'll fill up this room with gold and silver, a big room. And he does. He fills it up with 20 tons of gold. It's thought to be the largest ransom ever paid, maybe close to $500 million in today's money. And he gets all this gold and silver over, weeks and weeks from all over the empire to give to the Spanish so that he could be set free. And once they get all this gold and silver, they proceed to strangle him to death and execute him, right? And not live up to the ransom that they offered. Besides that, the Aztec and Inca are, the people that survive disease and stuff. There's still several million of them, and they form the core of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. They become the subjects of the Spanish Empire. A lot of them working as kind of like almost slave labor on what were known as encomiendas. We will talk about encomiendas in another topic in this unit. This is a statue of Lapu-Lapu, the man that killed Magellan on the Philippine Islands. Behind him there is a statue to Magellan, erected by the Spanish earlier in their empire. When the Philippines got their freedom from Spain, they put this statue up right across the way from Magellan's, the man that killed him. It's very cool. I encourage you to watch that video, that link that I posted on it. Oh, see, I forgot that I had all these pictures here. So, all right, France. Some of the last ones here. I'll try and go a little bit quicker here because getting close to being out of time. France was initially sending out explorers looking for the Northwest Passage, a way to get to Asia by going over the Northwest. Magellan had gone underneath South America through what's called the Strait of Magellan. You'll see that if you watch that video. Britain, France, they were looking for a Northwest Passage, a way to go over Canada and get to Asia, which, again, if it wasn't covered in ice a lot of the time, you could do. People do that now due to climate change, global warming, whatever we call it. A lot of the ice in the Arctic is melted throughout most of the year, and you can, for the first time in 100,000 years or whatever, sail a boat over the North Pole during certain parts of the year. You couldn't do this at the time that these guys were looking for it. But some of these explorers, Jacques Cartier in 1535 explored the St. Lawrence River and claims a lot of that stuff for France. Between 1609 and 1616, Samuel de Champlain explored a lot of what is today kind of Eastern Canada. And Cartier and Champlain, their exploration helped France and England to see that the Americas themselves were valuable and maybe kind of minimized any need to actually find Asia, rather than just investing in the development of the Americas' resources and establishing colonies there. What they do find as far as resources, they wanted gold like the Spanish, but in North America, they don't find gold at first. What they find is a land rich in furs, right, which your book describes as soft gold. And this is a major and valuable commodity of the era. Remember that the Russian Empire is being built trying to hunt down this, fur commodity. This ends up decreasing interest in even looking for a Northwest Passage, which didn't quite exist at that time. And also the interest shifts to developing resources in North America instead. 1608, the city of Quebec is established as a trading port. They still speak French there today. And later on, an explorer known as La Salle sails down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico and establishes little forts and stuff all along the way, eventually establishing New Orleans, another French colony at the bottom of Louisiana. The thing about the French to remember is that they were not aggressive colonists relative to their rivals. And I mean this in a couple ways. One, they were not sending out as many settlers or colonists as like the British. In 1754, a little bit before the American Revolution, there were about 70,000 French people living in North America, versus there was about a little over 1 million British people living in North America in the colonies there. Okay, so they were not aggressive in that sense. They also had better relations with the Indians. They generally were not as aggressive, although they were still killing Indians. They were not as aggressive with the Native Americans and generally had a better relationship with them due to the fur trade that they were kind of partners with Native Americans on. All right. So potential Northwest Passage, but not one that is found or used by Europeans at the time. Okay, and then England, our sort of mother country and cousin, all right? English exploration begins 1497 with John Cabot, or Giovanni Caboto, who's another Italian that kind of gets an anglicized name, who was looking for the Northwest Passage as well. He finds Newfoundland and claims all the way down to Chesapeake Bay. And the English are actually engaged in really tough competition with Spain at first. England lacked naval power that Spain or Portugal had early on, and engagements between sort of English and Spanish pirates or trade ships was very common, with the English, often kind of like suffering against a larger Spanish fleet, although both sides were kind of engaged in piracy. This is sort of the age of piracy, okay? One of the things that's really going to change this will be one of the battles that's fought later on. We'll talk about here in a second. Francis Drake is one of the kind of more famous English explorers and adventurers. He has a very cool story in his own right, but he's also essentially a pirate by the end of his life, that among other things completed the second successful circumnavigation and actually lives to the very end, right? Which Magellan didn't. It gets him made a knight by the Queen of England, who thought he was very cool. And he otherwise makes a name for himself in acts of war and piracy against the Spanish throughout the Caribbean and Atlantic Ocean. But Francis Drake circumnavigates the globe and helps establish several colonies for Britain. And then the thing that really helps, how do I go back here? The thing that really changes the situation of the British is their defeat of the Spanish Armada in the Protestant Reformation lecture that I gave you. Talk about the attempt by Philip II to invade Britain and make them Catholic again. But this British fleet that Francis Drake was actually kind of a part of as well, destroys 2/3 of the Spanish fleet and stops that invasion from happening, all right? And that ends up kind of turning the tables and makes Britain the most dominant kind of naval power in the Atlantic and maybe in the world from that point on. They do not establish their sort of like first successful colony in North America, though, until 1607. Francis Drake had tried to establish one earlier, known as the Roanoke Colony, but everybody there died mysteriously. They don't know what happened to them. They established the colony. They couldn't return to it to resupply it for a couple years because of conflict in Europe. And when they go back, all they find is the word Roanoke carved on a tree where the colony was, and all the colonists were gone. Maybe they went and lived with natives. Maybe they were all killed. But 1607, the colony of Jamestown is established in what is going to be the United States. And the very last thing, all right, kind of just in time, is to talk about the Dutch, who are the last to establish any kind of like sizable colonies in North America. The big explorer that's doing this on behalf of the Dutch is Henry Hudson, who explores the Hudson River Valley, being sponsored by the Dutch Republic in this case, not a king or a queen. And they establish New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan, right? What is today New York. New Amsterdam is New York. And it's the Dutch that first established that city before it is eventually captured and taken over by the British. All right. That concludes lecture 4.2. All right. And just kind of barely in time there. So